there are a lot of features that customers ask for in the buying process, but that end up not being used. And so he prompts the question, is the lack of usage not contributing to revenue? And he says, well, no, it might have helped the sale. So it does contribute to revenue in that case. True. He ends the argument with his typical approach, which I agree with actually, is that rather than focusing on a single metric, you need to use a variety of metrics or a constellation of metrics to come to an ultimate decision. But let's start with Crystal. I'm interested in your take on this and what thoughts it provoked for you.
When I was reading through this, I immediately reflected on my experience as chief of staff at Gojek. So when I became chief of staff, it was about 5,000 people in the company. And I noticed this pattern wherein a lot of these demanded for measured metrics were not necessarily metrics that people cared about optimizing, but that they knew would make them look good. And I see a lot of these, like, if I knew how much revenue my feature was contributing, then I could justify the size of my team or the role that I play here, even though this exercise is somewhat impossible and hard to do and it wouldn't change any real decision making. I want this metric anyways. And I was very quick to suss these out and say, I don't think this is worth spending time on, because I can't imagine that anyone would make any different decisions if we had this information.
Yeah. The other thing I find interesting about a lot of these is that if you read a blog post or a book on product management, they tell you that these are the things you should do. You should focus your effort on the things that are most likely to drive acquisition, retention, or monetization of your product. So every feature needs to go be measured back to the impact on acquisition, retention, monetization. So I can give this away because I'm not interviewing product managers, but one of my favorite questions is, how do you measure the success of feature X that you worked on or that you were proposing here? And almost everyone says, well, I would try to measure the impact it has on retention, monetization, or acquisition, because they know that's the answer they're supposed to give. And the follow-up question is, how? And everybody bumbles through it because it turns out it's basically impossible. It is impossible in most cases to do a holdout test on a specific feature and sort of say people who used it spent this kind of money versus didn't, because it's just too complicated and it doesn't make any sense. And so I think this idea of can we come up with a suite of proxy metrics for individual features that do measure other things? How retained is it? How well is it adopted? Yep. Who's the target audience? What's the satisfaction? How is it being used? Who is it being used by? And if I'll sell my own thing here in the product strategy program in Reforge. We have a framework called TARS that is designed to do this. I think you can at least compare different features to each other, but you can't actually measure the impact on retention or monetization directly. It's products are too complicated for that. They're not simple little Lego blocks that I added this and my revenue went up. It never works that way. So TARS is something that Casey Winters and I hypothesized, theorized, design based on our experience measuring the success of features for our product strategy program at Reforge. The T stands for target audience. So not every feature is built for every user of your product. A common mistake that people make is they measure the adoption, which is the second step, based on the overall population, whereas maybe a feature is only built for some subpopulation. So it's built for power users. It's built for people on this plan. So what percentage of your population does that represent? Sometimes it's 100%, sometimes it's some segment. Adoption is the A. Adoption basically stands for how many people ever used this. Of the target population, how many tried it, used it once? And I think growth metrics, it's best to measure this as some real activity, like an activation metric. So what does it mean to be activated on this feature? So for instance, for Instacart, lists, it might be I added an item to my list once, or I created a list for the first time. Retention is of the people who used it, how many came back. This one is the one that most companies and most teams never measure. They measure the total usage or adoption of a product. And then the last is satisfaction. And this one's really hard to measure and for many features isn't practical. But for certain kinds of features, you can measure some qualitative or even just the best example is, did this search result give you the answer you wanted? Right? I might be retained on search, but hate the results. And that's important information to understand the quality of the feature.